You're listening to LVB Podcast Show with your friend, advocate, and host, Alvaro.
Hello and welcome to LVB Show. My name is Alvaro and I'm very happy to be with you tonight. Before I introduce our guest, I want to say thank you to a few people. First of all, saying thank you to everyone listening. We have listeners in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in Africa, in Europe, in Latin America. And especially, I want to say thank you to the Savvy Services for the Blind for the wonderful event that I was able to attend virtually last week called Integrated Employment Conference. It was a wonderful event, and I was able to listen to the lady I'm going to interview tonight. And I said, she has a lot to say about employment, and I have a lot of questions for her. And so she was very kind to say yes. And so we have her tonight. Arielle Silverman, who is a disabled activist and a social scientist. She's very interested in making sure people understand things about disabilities. So, Arielle, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Arielle, I want to know your impressions about that wonderful conference.
Well, it was really an honor and a privilege to be at the conference. I wasn't able to attend the entire conference, but the sessions that I went to were all very well done. And I think there was definitely a positive philosophy about inclusive, integrated employment that I could really get on board with.
You have a great point, Ariel, and I also want to say thank you to Justin from social media, who was the one who invited me officially to this event. Okay, Ariel, a lot to cover tonight, and my first question to you is, I know you're blind, but what is the cause of your blindness?
So I was diagnosed with a condition called Leber's congenital amaurosis, and it's supposedly is a rare cause of blindness, but I know an awful lot of people who have it. So it doesn't seem maybe as rare to me as it does to members of the general public. But it's basically a class of genetic retinal disorders where retinas either don't develop completely or degenerate. So I have, and I've always had the same level of vision throughout my entire life. I can see light, I can see a little bit of shadow, but I've never had any color vision or anything really beyond light and shadow perception.
I see. And can you tell us a little bit about your educational background?
So I went through an early intervention program and a preschool program that was sponsored by an agency in Phoenix, Arizona called the Foundation for Blind Children. So I was in a preschool class with a few other students who were also blind. And that was where I learned most of my Braille and got a basic introduction to using a white cane. And then from kindergarten all the way through high school, I attended my local public schools as a mainstreamed blind student with the teacher of the visually impaired and orientation and mobility instructor and all of those typical kinds of services. After I graduated from my local neighborhood high school, I went to Arizona State University where I got my bachelor's degree in biology and psychology. And then I went to the University of Colorado Boulder and got my doctorate in social psychology. So I graduated in 2014. And then I was able to move into the working world from that point on.
You have done a lot, Ariel, I have to say. So I know you have been studying a lot, and I wonder what kind of basic tools and strategies have helped you succeed in studying.
Well, I was very fortunate in a lot of ways. I learned Braille. By the time I was 5 years old, I could read a basic book in grade 2 contracted Braille. And so all of my school materials in elementary and secondary school almost all of them were available in hard copy Braille. And I know nowadays people don't use hard copy Braille as much. It's all about the refreshable Braille displays and Braille note takers. I did have Braille note takers in middle school and high school that I used for writing my work and turning in my work, but I received the assignments in hard copy Braille. And then when I got to college, Braille became a little bit less available. So I was using materials in electronic format. I was also very fortunate that I started using a screen reader when I was 7 years old. I've been using JAWS all the way since 1992, and it's gotten much more sophisticated, of course, over the past 30 years as computers have gotten much more sophisticated. So I'm now, as a working professional, I'm on my computer, I would say at least 8 hours a day, using JAWS and a pair of earbuds to do pretty much anything that a sighted person would do on the computer.
Arielle, going into the subject at hand of employment, what are some of the reasons you think the unemployment rate is so high for people in the blind community?
Well, I think there's several reasons. Perhaps the most obvious one is that still there are a lot of employers who don't understand what blind people can do on the job. I've conducted a couple of survey research studies where we've gotten feedback from blind people in different stages of the employment process, where they've told us that discrimination is very much alive and well, even in 2021. And they've been flat out told by employers sometimes, oh, we need somebody who can see, or we need somebody who has a driver's license to do this job, even though it's not a driving related job. People sometimes have been discriminated against very openly. And then other times, employers just can get really awkward and uncomfortable, and they don't know what questions to ask. They don't know what they're allowed to ask. And so they end up just not connecting very well with the blind job seeker because they're feeling so awkward and unsure about what to do. And then that also leads to discrimination. There's also another huge problem is just the way that a lot of jobs are constructed and the technology that's required to be able to perform these jobs. There's a lot of inaccessibility, and everything from, if you think about a high school student might not be able to use a cash register to ring up customers at a retail store because it's not accessible, or sort money at a bank, or perform filing tasks in an office, because all those things require the ability to read print. And then all the way up to employers using these fancy proprietary software systems that are totally inaccessible, and the blind person has a lot of tasks that they simply cannot do, not because they're blind, but because the way the system is set up, they're not able to participate. And then finally, I would say there's a lot of barriers outside of specific jobs, but just more generally in our systems, like a lack of affordable, accessible, available transportation means that people can be really limited where they're able to seek employment, because if the bus stops running at 5 p.m., they have to be home, they have to leave work by 4:30 and so on. There's a lot of issues with our benefit systems where people get punished for working part-time or lower wage kind of employment is not enough to be livable, but is so much that they lose healthcare or cash benefits that they need to be able to survive. And so people choose not to work for that because they don't want to lose those kinds of supports. So I think it's complicated. There's a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of changes that are going to have to be made before the employment rate will start coming down, or the unemployment rate will start coming down.
That's a great point, Arielle. Okay, now I'm going to name some job-related terms, and I would like your definition, and if you can give our listeners an example of how to utilize that in when someone is looking for work. Like, for instance, when you talk at the conference about customizable jobs. What do you mean by that?
Well, that basically just means that the employer and a specific candidate work together to decide what jobs the candidate is going to perform that are jobs they can do and jobs that they're good at, and that also have benefit to the employer. So an example might be if someone applies for a job that requires a combination of answering the phone and filing paperwork, and they're blind, so they can't really file paperwork, but they have really good customer service skills on the phone. The employer might customize their job so that they only have to do the phone part, and somebody else will be hired to do all the paperwork.
Okay, this sounds interesting, Ariel. Let me ask you a follow-up about that, and is when you apply for a job and it gives you the job description and you say, all right, I have maybe 5 skills out of 8, the other 3 seem very tough for me. Is that an option for you to say to the employer, look, could we customize this job for me?
Well, I think it depends on the job and it depends on the employer. And if you're applying cold and you don't know the employer, I would say just go ahead and go through the application process and go through the interview process.
Mhm.
And if somebody asks me a question in an interview, like, what experience do you have with this? And I don't have any experience or don't have any skill in that area, I try to turn it into a positive by saying, well, I haven't done that before, but I've done something else that's related, or that's something that I've really wanted to learn how to do. And I'm really eager to get training to learn how to do that task. So I would say to go ahead and apply and then worry later on, because if the employer likes you well enough, they'll figure out how to accommodate your needs if there's 1 or 2 areas where you can't meet the job requirements. But I would also say, and this is going to be my answer, I think, to a lot of the follow-up questions, is one of the best ways that you can improve your chances of getting employed is by networking. Because if people know you, they're more likely to want to hire you and to go out of their way to make things accessible so that they can hire you. And so there's a few different ways people can expand their networks. So if you're interviewing with somebody who does know you, they're going to be more receptive. If they know you and they like you, they're going to be more receptive to customizing the position.
Okay, you have a great point. You have a great point. Now, job sharing, what is that?
Well, that's actually kind of similar to the last example that I gave. And it's basically just having a team of people share tasks amongst each other. Another example might be if somebody is blind and they can't access all of the software that the team is using, but they might have really good writing skills. And somebody who's sighted, who has weaker writing skills, might team up with that person. So they might help, the sighted person might help with navigating the inaccessible software, but then in exchange for that, the blind person might help with writing and editing their written work. So then both people end up benefiting, but more importantly than that, the team ends up benefiting because the work ends up being done more efficiently and higher quality.
Is like skills sharing, something like that, right? It's very interesting. Huh.
Right.
Now, we all know what teleworking is, but I want to know your opinion, Ariel, in terms of people looking for work online. And because of the pandemic and everything, maybe things are changing and employers are more aware that you can have wonderful workers that work from home. What is your take on that?
Well, it's funny because I was working right after I got my degree. I was doing a research fellowship that was on site, and my husband started teleworking, and I thought it was, he didn't really like teleworking, but I think it wasn't the teleworking, it was more just his particular job that he had wasn't a good fit. And he only worked that job for a couple of months, but I watched him teleworking and I was like, I don't want to do that. That would be really hard. And then I finished my fellowship and I decided to become self-employed and to do consulting as a self-employed research consultant. And so I started teleworking because, of course, I was self-employed. I didn't have an office. So the most natural thing to do was to work from home. And I realized just how great it was in so many ways to telework. And so now I've been doing it. It'll be 5 years. Actually, next week will be 5 years that I've been teleworking. And so when the pandemic hit, it was just like no biggie for me to keep teleworking. And of course, it's not for everyone. It's not for all personality types. And there can be barriers if you're teleworking for a company and they're not willing to provide the technology support that you need to make things accessible. And if you run into an accessibility issue, sometimes it can take longer to fix the accessibility issue if you're not on site with people who can help you out. But I would say overall benefits like far, especially for blind workers, like far outweigh the drawbacks of teleworking.
Now, another word is cognitive support. What does that mean?
So my understanding is that cognitive support is certain types of accommodations that can help people with what we might call neurodivergent people with different kinds of intellectual or learning disabilities to be able to do good work. And so some of the supports that I've heard of, they usually involve having someone like a job coach who comes on site with the person. And some examples of cognitive support might be breaking down tasks into smaller parts so that they're more manageable from a cognitive point of view, giving the person kind of detailed step-by-step instructions on how to perform a task, letting them practice the task to build confidence and proficiency before they have to execute the task. Using, this doesn't work so well for blind people, but using like pictures and graphic organizers sometimes can help people who have certain cognitive disabilities, or maybe verbal instructions aren't as clear, but visual instructions are a lot more easier to follow. And then things like reminders that you can put on your phone, things to help with if you have a memory impairment, like recording things. So some of these are cognitive supports or things that people can do themselves with technology or with different kinds of aids. And then some of them are provided by another person who's helping them.
Arielle, a follow-up for that one is some blind people that are not blind when they were born, but they were just losing their sight as their life progressed. And they find out that their memory is starting to go down. And does that qualify, do you think, Arielle, for asking for cognitive support to an employer saying, look, I am newly blind. I am finding out that I have some memory issues. I would like to maybe record certain conversations. I may need more time on a meeting to write down things. How would you approach that, Arielle, to an employer?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're experiencing a memory changes that are impacting your work productivity, it makes a lot of sense to brainstorm with your employer ways to address those things. And I mean, the memory impairment and the vision loss could be unrelated, or they could be related to each other. They both would require different accommodations, but some accommodations like recording could help with both disabilities. So it just sounds like a good time to brainstorm with your employer or to reach out to an agency like vocational rehab to try to get someone to come in and provide some of those accommodations.
Okay, interesting. Now, speaking of things, these paid and unpaid internships, when someone who is blind is looking for work, how can they find out if there is any paid or unpaid internship available in their area?
Well, that's still something that I'm trying to figure out because one of my jobs is helping youth who are blind in my state find internships, and I'm not the best at it, so I'm still learning. I think there are databases you can search online, like internships.com with specific keywords. But again, I think the most effective way is through networking. So identifying specific organizations that you would want to intern with, and then talking with someone there at a job fair, or maybe doing some volunteering for that organization, and then trying to find out what kinds of internships they might have. I mean, internship is basically just a temporary job, and they're going to be more often offered during summers just because they tend to go to students who are at school during the year. So there's more options during the summers, but they also tend to get more competitive during the summers. So sometimes if you're available in the fall or the spring, it's easier to get an internship because there's less people competing for one. There's also like listservs that you can join. Like for example, the National Federation of the Blind has a list called Jobs. And I'm not on it, but I imagine that some internships could be posted on that list.
And I was wondering, Arielle, is there any age limit to the internship thing or not?
It really just depends on the organization that you're talking to. I think a lot of organizations will ask the interns to be in school. There's not necessarily an age limit, but they do say like you need to be a university student to qualify. I mean, you could be 50 years old and be in school and you would still qualify. But it just depends on the organization. Some might not have any such requirement, and especially if they're kind of creating the internship for you, they may not have that requirement.
Okay, that's good. Now, job training. What is that?
I don't know if there's a consensus on the definition of job training. I think there's on-the-job training is more of an activity where you work for a company, but you're not necessarily, it's temporary. So it's kind of like an internship. And the focus is more on like learning how to do that job rather than actually being employed. And you might get paid either through the company or through like some third party that's helping people like you get job training. But I think what any kind of job training has in common is just that it's more, the focus is more on learning than on performing work for an employer. So the types of assignments and tasks that you get, they might not put you on like really important tasks that the company needs. They might have you do more like shadowing other employees and watching them and observing their work instead of being expected to put forward your own work.
Now, that job training in general, is it paid? Is it unpaid? How it works?
Again, it really just depends on the sponsor, the organization where you're doing it. In a lot of cases, it will be unpaid. But I know, for example, like my city, the city of Alexandria, sponsors a program for youth where they pay the youth to either get a summer job or to get job training, depending on whether they find an employer to match up the young person with. If they don't find an employer, then they get job training that's paid. I don't know what exactly the job training consists of. But again, it would just depend on who's sponsoring it. And if you're like a voc rehab client, you might be able to enroll in a paid job training program, or the agency pays you, and then you're getting training at some kind of company site.
Arielle, many people in the blind community, even in the United States, do not have a college degree, and you know that. And that becomes a struggle, Arielle, and for our listeners. Imagine this situation, Arielle. We're going to talk about hypothetics here. For instance, someone over 40, 45 maybe, does not have a college degree, has skills, wants to get into any kind of profession. Let's put an example, a social worker, for instance. What would you recommend them to do, Arielle?
Well, if you say they have the skills to be a social worker, then they've probably gotten some kind of experience working with those populations. I think a lot of this will depend on the requirements of the country that they're in, and whether having a degree is a really solid requirement in order to get licensed as a social worker. But even if you can't get licensed as a social worker, you might be able to do other things that meet that same goal in terms of helping people without a college degree. Or of course you could, consider the pros and cons of getting some kind of a college degree, but if that's not feasible at the moment, again, I think really the most important thing would be to get to know what kinds of organizations meet your passion and your goals, and then find out the credentials of the people they employ, find out about internships, apprenticeships, on the job training that they provide, and maybe do some volunteering and get some experience that way.
Arielle, that sounds interesting. Now, how about online courses? Does any of those can help someone build the skills for a specific job that they may not have the degree for, but maybe they can study something to improve their skills?
Yeah, so I know there's a lot of online courses that have really taken off over the past decade. That is not an area that I'm knowledgeable about personally. There are some online courses where you can take and you can get a certificate of completion in a particular area. I don't know if that would necessarily be able to replace a college degree. Again, it really just depends on the job area and how much and what the requirements are. If you need to have a particular type of license. But there's certainly nothing wrong with looking at what some of those online courses are. And if it's something that you're passionate about, even if you're not totally sure if it would lead to employment, it might be worth pursuing that.
And Arielle, about places for our listeners who are looking for online courses that are fully accessible, do you know of any?
I don't.
Okay, good to do research on that for our listeners, because you just never know. Now, there is something that comes to mind, and is that many people in the blind community says, okay, I would like to work outside the disability field. Maybe I would like to work at McDonald's. Maybe I would like to work at Office Depot. Maybe I would like to work at a car rental, whatever it may be. So, what would be your recommendation or your tips for people to look outside the disability field, knowing that, of course, maybe organizations are not going to be so keen on hiring people who are blind, not knowing what to expect, etc.?
Well, again, your best hope, I think, is to get to know people and show people what you're capable of. So if you make friends with somebody who works at Office Depot, they can vouch for you. They can tell the hiring manager that they know you and they know that you're capable, and be able to speak up on your behalf. I would also say just going out and putting in applications, even if you need to put in 100 applications, you might find one hiring manager who's extremely open-minded. And I think nowadays it's taking a lot of time, but companies are very slowly beginning to recognize the benefits of hiring people with disabilities. And antiquated ideas about that, I think, are very gradually beginning to change. So I would encourage someone to just keep putting themselves out there, keep applying, keep going to conferences, professional conferences in whatever area they're interested in, and looking for volunteer unpaid work and internships if they're not able to get paid employment.
Arielle, let's say one of our listeners is saying, okay, I'm looking for work, but I have this situation. I have so many interests, like I want to work at a hospital, I want to work at a rehab place, I want to work at a radio station, I want to work maybe at a disability organization, I want to work at a supermarket. How do you pick what's going to be the field you're going to get into if you have so many interests?
That's a great question. I certainly know a lot of people like that. And there's not one clear answer. I would say one strategy you might use is to just pick one thing and go for it. If they're all equally interesting to you, just, pick one thing, and you can always leave that field and go into a different field later if you decide it's not the right fit. And also, again, it comes back to networking. Follow people you know in those fields and see which one of those fields you have the most connections in, because that's where you're probably most likely to actually secure a job.
Now, Arielle is an independent consultant, and some of the people listening to us is saying, okay, maybe I would like to become an entrepreneur. I want to be a self-employed. What are your tips about that, Arielle?
Well, I would say, first of all, start slow. You're not going to have a full self-employed portfolio overnight. I still don't quite have a full portfolio. And so maybe think about just hiring 1 or 2 clients or having 1 or 2 gigs a year to start out. And I think the hardest thing, perhaps, or maybe for me, this was the easiest part, but maybe for some folks, it'll be the hardest part, is to figure out what good or service you're going to be selling as a self-employed business owner. So for me, my basic process was that I was trained as an academic researcher and I wanted to keep doing research, but I didn't want to sell my research to universities. I wanted to sell it to people and nonprofit organizations that would actually implement the findings of the research. I also was things happened kind of outside of my control, where I was offered a couple of gigs doing disability training. And so I decided to include that as part of my self-employed services that I offer. So it might be worth thinking about what are 1 or 2 things that you are very skilled at, preferably where you've already had some sort of experience. And it could be unpaid experience, it could be paid, it could be both. So that you can tell potential clients, I've done this before, and in fact, here's some testimonials or some people who can vouch for how good I am at this particular skill. And that could be anything. That could be baking, that could be childcare, that could be doing research. I mean, that could be really pretty much anything that you've demonstrated competence in that you want to try to sell. And then I think the next step would be kind of writing up a statement or like your kind of basic sales pitch of like, here's what I have to offer and here's why you should hire me to give you this good or service. And think about some potential clients who would actually buy your good or service. And again, if you start with people you know, I mean, my first clients, the first 2 years were all people I'd worked with in the past, people who knew my parents, people who friends of friends, until I eventually had a website and then I started getting cold calls. But I think my first cold call was about 3 years after I started. So, start small and you'll get bigger over time. And, you don't need a detailed business plan, but it is good to think a little bit about what exactly are you selling and who are you selling it to?
Arielle, would you consider to get a normal job someday, or you feel you're going to be an independent consultant forever?
That's a very tough question. It's something that I've thought about a lot the past 5 years. And it's kind of funny because I did actually apply for a full-time job last December and I didn't get it, but they offered me a pretty big consulting contract instead. So now I've been consulting with them. And if they offered me a full-time job later, I probably would accept it. I think I would, but I'm, bound to change my mind in a few months if anything changes. There's a lot of things that I like about the consulting. I don't know if I would necessarily plan to be doing it until I'm 70 years old. I am also working on writing a memoir and, I have no idea once that gets published, if it'll take off, how much effort and energy I want to put into it. But it might end up being kind of a tool in my consulting toolbox. So I really don't know at this point. I'm definitely open to going back to the full-time employment, but it really just depends on what the options are.
That's a great point, Arielle. Okay, so that's pretty much all I wanted to know, Arielle. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, thank you for listening today. I think I try to stay optimistic, even though there are a lot of reasons why the unemployment rate is so high. And sometimes it seems like those reasons aren't going away anytime soon, but I try to be optimistic that there are definitely employers who recognize our potential. And I think as we move into the next generation, that number of employers is going to go up. So I would encourage everyone to just stay out there, keep trying, and keep encouraging each other.
That's great advice for our listeners. So, Arielle, how can people reach out to you? What's your website?
So I would encourage anyone who is curious about my website to go to www.disabilitywisdom.com. So DISABILITYWISDOM.com. And there is a blog that is attached to my website that you might enjoy reading. You can also send me an email at arielle@disabilitywisdom.com.
Well, it's been a great privilege to have you on, Arielle. Thank you so much for saying yes to this interview. And
thank you.
My pleasure, Arielle. And for our listeners, remember that you can be on the show. You just have to email me at lowvisionbureau@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at lowvisionbureau. And remember to smile. And well, my friends, this is all for now. I'm very happy to be doing the show once again in a very powerful year as it has been for everybody. So this is Alvaro from LVB Show saying good night.